Hey there, everyone. My name's Dr. John Keyes. I teach history at the Royal Military College of Canada here in beautiful Kingston, Ontario. And today I'm making a public-facing video on just some of the basics of nuclear weapons, just in terms of terminology and taxonomy. So by taxonomy, I mean the different kinds of nuclear weapons and how we classify them. Now, why spend my time recording a public-facing video on kind of arcane technical terms? Well, I actually think it's quite important, and that's because, unfortunately, nuclear weapons are very much in the public space. There are a lot of public debates, and a lot of non-nuclear weapons people are discussing nuclear weapons, which, let's be clear, is a good thing, in that, not that nuclear weapons are on the table, but in that people who kind of are outside the nuclear weapons community in terms of scholars and practitioners are discussing the implications of nuclear weapons, because they're very important if you're interested in things like continuing human civilization and all that kind of noise. Now, when I started my PhD work back in 2019, it's when I really started getting into like a very detailed study of the Cold War, including the development, deployment, and policy surrounding nuclear weapons. And at that point, it was a fairly obscure subject, right? It had fallen out of favor. There weren't a lot of nuclear threats going around. There was some talk of nuclear terrorism. So a lot of these old Cold War terms, only I really need to know them, or a select few people needed to know these terms, or it came up in their daily lives. But it's just not the case anymore, right? As of the time of recording, in March 2026, there's an ongoing war in Iran surrounding with one of the stated justifications being the Iranian nuclear program. Here in Canada, there are discussions about perhaps Canada acquiring nuclear weapons. As an aside, it's a very bad idea, and we'll kind of see why, or a very impractical idea that they would really do much. And so it's a public debate now, and to have a public debate, to understand what, if we're going to understand the public issues on Canadian nuclear weapons acquisition generally, or, for example, Russian threats of nuclear weapons use in Ukraine and what that means and escalation, we have to understand what we're talking about, because all nuclear weapons aren't the same. They're not magic. Just because a state has a nuclear weapon doesn't mean that a war won't happen. In just over the past couple of years, we've seen India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed states, trade shots, right? So, without going nuclear. So, just because a state has nuclear weapons, it doesn't mean a conflict will necessarily be nuclear, and just because a state has nuclear weapons, it doesn't necessarily mean there won't be a conflict, right? So, I hope I've sold you on the idea that perhaps we need to get into a little bit more nuance when we're talking about what a nuclear weapon is, because nuclear weapons aren't all the same. So, let's just have a look, right? Just to give you a small bit of background, the idea that nuclear weapons really were kind of almost magic in the sense that, they're so powerful, they're so disproportionate almost to any kind of military utility that there was not much sense in discussing how one would win a nuclear war, because the point of nuclear weapons, it's unwinnable, so the point of nuclear weapons was to deter war, not to win a war. That idea, very prominent among, but again, some scholars and practitioners in the general public and politicians, roughly speaking, in the United States, in the West, to some extent in the Soviet Union, although we don't know as much about that. Roughly speaking, from about 1945 until the early to mid-1950s. But things began changing. Things began changing in the mid-1950s when you got a whole new generation of nuclear weapons. These nuclear weapons being thermonuclear weapons. Long story short, they're much more powerful than the kind of fission bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as devastating as those weapons were. Not only were our thermonuclear bombs much more powerful, you can actually make them much smaller. And since you can make them much smaller, you can do different things with them. You can make them very small, employ them credibly on the battlefield, or realistically. Anyway, you can employ them in battle systems that don't need a lot of infrastructure, that can move around a battlefield. You can also do things like put them on missiles, and you can put those missiles either in the ground or on the ground or in submarines, or even attach missiles to bombers and do all kinds of different things. And so around this time, early 50s, mid 50s, and towards the late 50s, you get a bunch of different thinkers, especially in the US, developing a whole bunch of different concepts about what deterrence is. And essentially, in terms of tracing who had which idea first, when, I'm not going to get into that, but I will point out two excellent we'll say vintage bits of nuclear deterrence theory up on the screen there. In that these two guys, Albert Wohlstetter and Thomas Schelling, really developed and publicized a really interesting vocabulary to talk about some of the contradictions in deterrence. And one of the central parts, one of the central ideas here is that if I want to deter you from launching a nuclear war, because we both agree that nuclear war isn't worth fighting, right? Then I have to convince you that I'm willing to fight one, and I have to prepare to fight one. So I have to actually have a credible plan to employ nuclear weapons, right? And I actually can't have you believe that I'm too rational to never use them, because if you think I'm too rational to never use them, that they're not deterring. Even though, logically, the only thing I can do with these things is to deter them. Right? If you need to pause and perhaps, take some ibuprofen, I get it. The headaches do come on. Now, so that's a problem. The other big problem is that if I have all these kinds of different kinds of nuclear weapons, right, and the only thing I can do with them is go full all-out nuclear war, what that means is it's not super credible, right? Imagine, as an example, if you're having a dispute with your neighbor about their dandelions blowing onto your yard. For some reason, you don't like dandelions because you just don't, and they're not doing a good job of picking them, and you're super, super fastidious about having a monoculture green grass lawn, and your only threat is if I get any more dandelion seeds on my lawn, I'm going to burn your house down. They're probably not going to do anything about the dandelions, right? Because by burning their house down, you're probably going to burn your house down. And even if you don't burn your own house down, you're probably going to go to prison, right? So it makes much more sense to say, well, maybe I'll call city bylaw or launch a spurious lawsuit or something nasty, right? So you need something more credible at a lower level. And so once you do that, you need to actually have a whole bunch of different nuclear delivery systems at different yields. So basically, a yield is how big the blast is, right? Different kinds of nuclear weapons at different yields with different characteristics. Because once I have that, I can say, well, depending on the crisis, right? I have a pretty good use case for nuclear weapons in pretty much any crisis, and that will probably escalate. And you can't trust me not to be fully rational, so I'm willing to escalate it, and therefore we have deterrence, right? So yeah, you have a bunch of these ideas start coming out in the 50s, and you start getting a more complex terminology that's still quite useful today. So let's go over some of those terms. Right. And I have but up here because one of the recurring themes I have when talking with people who are interested in this issue but haven't necessarily done the background reading or research on it is, well, but won't any conflict involving nuclear weapons just escalate to the maximum anyway? And since we can't control it, don't we only need a few weapons? And but who cares, kind of thing. Well, I think it matters quite a bit. And so when I explain some of these concepts, I'm not just going to explain them in terms of the abstract, in terms of this is what Albert Wohlstetter said, or Tom Schelling, or R.J. Sutherland, or George Lindsay, or André Beaufret, or whoever. I'm going to use a real world example, and that is the kind of mutual, we hope, mutual deterrence in nuclear terms between India and Pakistan, because they've recently fought a hot war, right? And so we can look at kind of how this works in action. Right, so let's get to it. So one of the first terms I'll introduce to you guys is the idea of no first use or declared first use of nuclear weapons. So no first use, or NFU, is the idea that if a war starts between our two countries, I won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. I might be the last to. I might finish the nuclear fight, but I won't start it. On the flip side, you also have different kind of states or different declared policies by governments of declared first use, what I'm calling DFU, right? And perhaps the most notable example of this was the U.S. policy in the 1950s, I think unfairly called massive retaliation, but basically saying if we can't match the Soviets, the Americans and their NATO allies couldn't match the Soviets soldier for soldier, tank for tank, aircraft for aircraft in Europe in terms of conventional forces in the 1950s. They just couldn't. And so the declared first use policy was if the Soviet Union overruns NATO defenses in Western Europe, basically we will just remove the Soviet Union. Right? Like one of the first operational war plans was called Broiler. Right? So that's declared first use, right? I'm willing to use nuclear weapons in response to non-nuclear aggression. Okay? That's what declared first use means. So, right. The Soviets, by the way, also built tactical nuclear weapons. So by the 50s, 60s, what you get is that you have the Soviets and the Americans both saying they have a range of nuclear systems. We'll get into everything from tactical nuclear systems up to strategic nuclear systems pointed at each other to deter each other. However, if you're in China, at that point, the Chinese governments had they initially started their nuclear programs to deter the Americans for pretty good reason, actually, because during the Korean War, the American General Douglas MacArthur actually asked repeatedly to use nuclear weapons to just basically nuke Chinese forces coming over the Yalu River. Actually, basically just nuke the snot out of China. The Chinese had pretty good reason to have a nuclear weapons program. Then you get something called the Sino-Soviet split, and you actually get a border war between the Soviets and the Chinese. Fraternal socialist brothers shooting at each other. And so the Chinese actually ended up developing a nuclear deterrent that wasn't first use. They couldn't match the Americans or the Soviets industrially. They focused a lot on conventional forces. But what they basically said was, no first use, but if you use nuclear weapons, so will we. So any conflict we have will stay conventional, which makes a whole lot of sense, right? So in 1964, you get the first Chinese nuclear test, and pretty much from the start, the Chinese government was pretty clear on a no first use of nuclear weapons. Anyway, as clear as 1960s Chinese government, PRC governments could get. Right. However, at this time, you also have the government of India. Now, there had been some border clashes in 1962 between some disputed territory between India and China. The war hadn't gone very well for the Indians. They fought bravely, but it just didn't go well for them. So the Indians, seeing that the Chinese had nuclear weapons, were worried that they could be kind of coerced in any kind of, even a minor border skirmish or any kind of diplomatic confrontation, right? If the Chinese have nuclear weapons and we don't, we're going to be at a disadvantage. So we need to build a nuclear arsenal to deter the Chinese threatening to use their nuclear arsenal against us. So now you have, to recap, a nuclear arsenal in the People's Republic of China that was designed to deter the Americans and the Soviets from threatening to use nuclear weapons against China. And the Indians, seeing that nuclear arsenal, needed to basically do the same thing, but with China. So the Indians took a really interesting approach, actually. They conducted what was called a PNE, or Peaceful Nuclear Explosion, in 1974. It sounds crazy. However, there was a big push for a PNE, Peaceful Nuclear Explosion, as part of the sort of drive called the Atoms for Peace kind of idea in the 1950s. The idea that, nuclear energy, including nuclear explosions, could actually be used to benefit humanity as a whole. For example, if you want to have a big mine, why use a bunch of TNT when you could just nuke the ground? We don't think like that now. This is also a time when they put lead in the gas, right? So bear with me. So the Indians, they detonated an underground nuclear device in 1974, but it was quite interesting in how they did it. The weapon was kind of too ungainly to actually mount on anything, like a bomber or a missile. So they're saying, we can build a nuclear explosive, but we're not going to weaponize it. Which is quite interesting. Very, very interesting. It's a concept called hedging. And I will link a book. I will link to a book in the description that is really worth reading if you're interested in the idea of hedging and how that's part of strategy. Anyway, so the Indians they had this capability to build nuclear weapons, and they said, but we're not going to. And so they're trying to deter without escalating at a kind of like grand strategic level. Quite fascinating. However, enter another player, Pakistan. Now, the Pakistanis had a increasingly formal alliances with both the United States and China, or at least cooperation with the United States and China, and also they had a border disputes with India. The big dispute being two biggest disputes being Jammu and Kashmir and the status of what was then East Pakistan and is now Bangladesh. During the Bangladesh War of Liberation in 1971, or from an Indian Pakistani point of view, the Second Indo-Pakistani War, the war didn't go well for the Pakistanis. They lost, and East Pakistan became the independent country of Bangladesh. So now the Pakistanis, they've lost a chunk of their territory, and they're saying, boy, the Indians have detonated a nuclear weapon, or a nuclear explosive, right? And we have an ongoing dispute with them over Kashmir. We have occasional clashes. We don't want to be intimidated by the Indians either. The other thing is, from a Pakistani point of view, their forces had been defeated in the field by a much larger country. And so the Pakistanis began building their own nuclear weapons in 1972, and when they, going into the 1990s, it was pretty clear that the Pakistanis had a nuclear program. It's pretty clear that they were ready to weaponize it, because not only had they built just an obvious nuclear program, they'd also built delivery systems, including ballistic missiles. And so within weeks of each other, in May 1998, both the Pakistani, first the Indians, and then the Pakistanis detonated nuclear weapons. The Indians did that to demonstrate they knew the Pakistanis functionally had nuclear weapons they hadn't tested. The Indians needed to show them that, right, we had that peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, codenamed Smiling Buddha, by the way. Interesting. Anyway, so we had that peaceful nuclear explosion, but we're going to show you that, by the way, we can also weaponize these things, and we have. We're going to declare that we've weaponized these things. We're going to declare ourselves a nuclear weapon state. Of course, once the Indians do that, then the Pakistanis have to do that too. So within weeks of each other, we get competing nuclear tests. Here's the thing. The nature of the Indian and Pakistani nuclear deterrence is quite different. The Indians maintain a no first use policy. The Pakistanis don't. The official Pakistani nuclear doctrine it's some policy, I should say, is full spectrum deterrence. Basically, if they're getting overrun, if the security of the country is under threat, if they're about to be occupied, they will escalate to using nuclear weapons, ideally at a tactical level, and build their way up. Right? So now we can see how complicated this gets and why it's so important to understand that not all nuclear weapons are the same, because the size of their the size of the arsenals aren't all the yield sizes aren't all the same, the delivery systems aren't all the same, the purpose aren't all the same, and so on and so on. And if you could imagine, right, again, why it's so important to understand how this works. Here's a map of some disputed territories between India and Pakistan, and India and China, right? India and Pakistan, that's in orange, red circle in orange, and India and the PRC in red circle with blue filling. Orange because that's a conflict involving two states, with one state that has a declared first use policy that is loosely aligned with China, or actually increasingly tightly aligned with China. And then, of course, you have the blue areas where two states have had border clashes, armed clashes, that both have nuclear weapons, but no declared first use. But boy, if you look at that overlap, there's a lot of chance for accidents to happen, right? And in case you're feeling too good about the situation, here are some ongoing conflicts in that region, right? There's a declared war, which is kind of novel today, between Pakistan and the Taliban government in Afghanistan. There's an ongoing civil war in Myanmar, and there are widespread political protests and we'll say instability in Bangladesh, which is also tied through the Rohingya issue to what's going on in Myanmar, right? So very delicate, and this requires more nuance than just saying there's nukes involved and nukes prevents all conflicts, because look at the map. Okay, right. So, I'll also note, right, a lot of states, the way they employ nuclear weapons isn't necessarily, sometimes it's not even just to deter or to fight wars, but for signaling. This is mostly done informally, but hats off to the French, they actually have a formal policy of, what's it? L'avertissement ultime. The ultimate warning. Stated French nuclear doctrine is, push comes to shove, we will, you can read it on the screen, should a state engage in hostile action against France, having misjudged the scope of its vital interests, a nuclear strike could be carried out as a warning, which is, wow, it goes hard, right? So, all of that said, right, getting to, now that we've gone over some of those terms, right, for example, terms we've gone over so far, right, declared first use, no first use, we now have, I'll introduce you to a few kinds of categories of nuclear weapons. Now, here's a simple table I've made for a document, which I'll link in the comment and the description, a proposed taxonomy, how I kind of classify nuclear weapons. Let's be clear, these are crude categories. They're very crude categories. Tactical nuclear weapons can be of various different sizes. Strategic nuclear weapons can be of various different sizes. It's more helpful to think of them in terms of role and how they're delivered than their raw size. But roughly speaking, tactical nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons meant to be used on the battlefield. So, big example during the Cold War, right? NATO planning to use tactical nuclear weapons. Like, if the Soviets, this came about in the 1950s, right? If the Soviets managed to overrun NATO forces in West Germany, well, ideally what you do is, there were a bunch of nuclear sharing agreements, in fact some of them still in place, between the United States and various NATO allies, to release nuclear weapons for employment, ideally the smallest yield possible, essentially as very big conventional explosives, right? If you can have an infantry battalion with a couple of, for example, or except an infantry, let's say a NATO corps with a couple of these things, an MGR Honest John. By the way, that's in Canadian colors. The Canadians actually operated Honest Johns from the early 60s up until about 1972. Each of these had a 20 kiloton, so a Nagasaki-sized bomb on the tip of the missile. If you're able to destroy, the Soviets at a 5-1 or 10-1 or whatever advantage, that can stop the conventional attack before it becomes an all-out nuclear exchange. We'll get into whether that would have worked, but roughly speaking, tactical nuclear weapons designed for battlefield use, relatively short range. They don't need to go super far because they're targeting enemy forces, and the control tends to be delegated down to battlefield commanders once the release authority has been granted. Between above tactical nuclear weapons, we have strategic nuclear weapons. Some of you who are watching this will say there's a lot in between, and yes, that's what part 2 of this will be about, but bear with me. Now, these are weapons designed to either hit enemy cities or enemy strategic nuclear forces, right? So this is, the very these are big weapons targeting either big cities or big kind of weapons installations. They tend to be in very specific systems. They're not part of a conventional battle. The rough equivalent, if you're thinking about the Second World War, right? Yes, you had ground support aircraft, like, for example, the P-38, or the American P-38, or the British Typhoon, or the German Stuka, right? And these could drop bombs too. And then you had big strategic bombers like the Lancaster or the B-17 that are hitting cities, right? Similar idea, similar use of the term. So, these come in a variety of options. We'll get into them, but that's the rough difference. So just to recap, right? Tactical, designed for battlefield use. Typically, they're kind of spread out among conventional force commanders, right? When they get release authority, they can then use those weapons in accordance with a plan integrated with conventional forces. And the idea here is that you fight a conventional war with nuclear weapons without it becoming a full-on nuclear exchange, right? Ideally, it's only the battlefields that are irradiated and not everybody else. It's far-fetched, but that's what it's designed for. Then you have strategic nuclear weapons where, again, big targets, either enemy nuclear forces or enemy cities. Now, you'll see here, there are 2 new terms I've introduced and kind of snuck in, and that's first strike and second strike. So, what do I mean by that? Oh, by the way, if you're looking at what big strategic systems might look like, for example, it can include bombers, including bombers with air-launched cruise missiles, like here you see a Tu-22M with KH-22, I believe. And then you can see a Trident SLBM, or submarine launched ballistic missile, doing a test fire, and a rendering of the Ohio class SSBN U.S. Navy ships that can fire them. Okay, so first and second strike, right? I know, even more terms, but bear with me. It's a simple idea, right? And the simple idea here being that, if you can imagine, it's the 1950s. The Soviets, they have, in 1957, they launched Sputnik, and they have like a couple of pretty crude, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. But they're not what you think of. Like, they're not missiles in silos. You have to fuel them above the ground. They're like a conventional space rocket, right? Hard to achieve surprise with them. So the vast majority of nuclear weapons are carried in nuclear-capable bombers, right? Here's the thing about bombers. They're vulnerable, right? They can be very good weapons in terms of delivering nuclear weapons, very good delivery systems in terms of delivering nuclear weapons, that they're very accurate, they can carry huge payloads, right? They're very controllable. If we're on the way to attack targets and the crisis dissipates, it's easier to call them back than, say, missiles. But they're really vulnerable because, boy, even if you put them in hardened shelters, right, if someone nukes the runway, game over. And so what you had was, in the 1950s, both sides had, well, the Americans had a much bigger arsenal, but anyway, both sides had a growing number of powerful nuclear weapons in kind of use it or lose it, right, delivery systems. If you could get your bombers, if you could sense an incoming enemy attack and you had enough air defenses to kind of delay that attack, or attrit it enough to get your own bombers off the ground, then you'd be able to retaliate against the attacker. But if they caught you by surprise, it's over. And so what that did was it created an incentive that whoever used their bombers first could win. And that's really dangerous, right? In a crisis, essentially, both sides have a strong incentive to pull the trigger first, right? And also note, by the way, in terms of acronym, C2 just means command and control. So that's not great. So if opponent A sees that opponent B, they've let their guard down, they immediately send all of their bombers, or we'll say even 75% of their bombers, right? And attack the enemy's nuclear-capable bombers, their air defenses, and their command and control systems. Even if the enemy has a few bombers left, right? Knowing that you have, right, so opponent B still has a few bombers left, opponent A can signal then, basically broadcast, saying, yeah, but I still have some nuclear weapons left. Since you don't really have a coordinated air defense or command and control system anymore, if you even think of trying to use them against my cities, I will destroy all of your cities, right? Again, not great. Big incentive for both sides to use nuclear weapons first to prevent this from happening, right? So that's what we call a first strike. And first strikes are typically counter force, right? Counter force first strike just means, I'm going first and I'm targeting your strategic nuclear forces and their supporting infrastructure, okay? Right. By the late 50s, going to the early 60s, however, what you start seeing are a bunch of new systems being introduced by both sides that prevent a first strike from being super successful. So stuff like new ICBMs, right? ICBMs like, for example, the Titan II that you saw at the first slide of this video, right? These big missiles in silos, concrete silos in the ground. Even if the enemy hits you with a bunch of stuff, chances are at least a few of those missiles will be intact, quite a few of them. Also, submarine launched ballistic missiles. It's really hard to hit all the submarines. You don't know where all the enemy submarines are, and if even one of those submarines survives, they have enough nuclear firepower to really, really mess your day up. The thing is about ICBMs and SLBMs, they're not super accurate, and they don't need to be, right? Because they don't need to hit a nuclear complex. Because if you think about it, right, even if you can survive a first strike, right, let's say opponent A attacks opponent B with a big first strike, a whole bunch of bombers, they come over the horizon, they take out most of opponent B's nuclear-capable bombers, take out most of their air defenses, but let's just say enough of their command and control systems survive to launch a retaliatory strike, enough of their missiles survive to launch a retaliatory strike, and enough of their submarines survive to launch a retaliatory strike, then they're going to make it hurt for opponent A, right? If I only have, if I have a limited number of systems left and they're not super accurate, and I need to, so I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to hit your bomber bases now, I'm going to go straight for your cities, right? And I'm going to make it super clear that I'm doing that. So when I'm then, opponent B is communicating to opponent A, even if you get a first strike that is 50 or 75% effective, right? My second strike, called a second strike counter value, that's basically counter city strike, will basically end your civilization. So best not to start things, right? So just to recap, first strikes, right? That's the person who uses strategic nuclear weapons first, right? They tend to be counter force, right? Strategic nuclear weapons first against an enemy's ability to use their strategic nuclear weapons. If you can survive a first strike, and if you can build a system that can very openly showing the world that you can survive a first strike, what you're saying is, even if you launch that counter force first strike, enough of my strategic nuclear systems will be left over that I could then retaliate with a counter value, so against your cities, second strike, right? So attacking my nuclear forces means essentially attacking your own cities. So just maybe let's not. Right. Okay. I'll get into a bit about that fuzzy line between tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I will spend a little bit of time on it. Now, again, the line is fuzzy. It's a fuzzy line between how these systems are employed. But roughly speaking, right, the idea here is that by using, there's sort of a green line here, right, that everyone says these weapons are tactical, so if I use them, like, and it happens to hit one of your cities, I don't really mean for it to hit your cities. And usually, it seems silly, but there are ways of signaling this. So you can, for example, say, like, I'm launching nuclear weapons using systems that don't have that long a range. So if you detect a bunch of launches with these systems in this area, you know I'm probably just going for your forces. How this might play out in practice, however, it's there's a lot of discussion as to how credible this is. It's worth another video or 10, but let's just go over a scenario, right, in terms of how these things interact. So opponent A attacks opponent B. It's quickly overrunning their conventional forces. We'll say opponent A has way more tanks, artillery, whatever. They're overrunning opponent B's conventional forces. Opponent B then then employs, I'll say, tactical nuclear weapons to stop the enemy advance. Here's the thing, right? One, especially if you're doing it in a place like, say, Europe or South Asia, I guess even North America, most of North America nowadays, like, there's enough population density that you're probably going to accidentally hit someone's city at some point, right? And then two, when you look at how military targeting is done, even for conventional stuff, yeah, okay, ideally I attack your conventional forces and your tactical nuclear weapons, but I'm also probably going to attack your command and control systems. Now, I can say I'm only attacking your strategic command and control systems and not your tactical or operational, anyway, command and control systems, but, right? If opponent B then begins hitting opponents A, C2 systems and says, trust us, bro, it's not strategic, well, that's something someone doing a first strike would say, right? That's a problem. Air defenses, right? To launch tactical nuclear weapons, I need to destroy your conventional air defenses, but the line between your conventional air defenses designed to protect your own forces and the stuff designed to protect your strategic nuclear infrastructure is can get fuzzy, right? Then also keep in mind, right, this is creating huge amounts of electromagnetic interference. Your systems are probably giving you all kinds of false readings, and you have an incentive to launch early, right? To take out their forces between, it might, for example, to opponent A, look like I failed first strike, right? They tried to first strike us, it didn't work. Well, we better first strike them before they figure out they've made a mistake, right? And so then we could see how this would escalate into a full-on nuclear exchange. Would it? It's really interesting, right? In terms of how different governments, different leaderships see this problem, because is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It depends, right? Let's, for example, I'll finish with a quick example of a very quick and dirty summary of some of these debates that went on between NATO allies in the 1950s and 1960s. The Americans were big on bringing in, essentially recognized that it was an economic problem that the Western democracies simply could not meet the amount of military spending the totalitarian Soviets could. And so we're going to introduce all kinds of tactical nuclear weapons so that we can defeat a Soviet conventional invasion, right, without responding to a strategic exchange. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because if war breaks out, we want to keep it limited. And two, because you already had NATO allies, especially, for example, in France, asking, like, Charles de Gaulle, for example, at one point asked John F. Kennedy, like, would you be willing to sacrifice New York for Paris? Right? Basically saying, if the Soviets invaded Western Europe, would you be willing to risk launching a full-on nuclear first strike against the Soviets, knowing that that would put American cities at risk? I think not. You probably wouldn't. Right? So one of the ideas behind tactical nuclear weapons is like, well, we can credibly defeat the Soviets. We can actually we have nuclear sharing agreements, right? Dual key arrangements, essentially, with, for example, the Italians, the Germans, the Danes, I believe the Canadians, for that matter, and the Brits, among others, to basically say, well, look, will defeat them on the battlefield. And that will be able to defeat the Soviets without going to a full-on nuclear exchange, which also increases our credibility with our allies, saying, well, we won't even be risking New York or Paris because we're going to stop them, ideally in East Germany, right, with tactical nuclear weapons. The British, on the other hand, are having severe economic problems, right, coming out of the Second World War. There's that, they have a significant manpower shortage in terms of labor shortage in the UK. And they're busy fighting a whole bunch of counterinsurgencies all over the world, and they say, like, actually, chaps, we really do think this probably will escalate, and that's a good thing because it just makes, it means that, going back to those two papers I showed you, Tom Schelling would point out that to make my deterrent credible, I have to convince you that I actually don't have full control over all of my nuclear weapons, right? So I probably can't manage a crisis as closely as you might think I can, so best just not to have one. This is roughly how the British were thinking, and so they'd say, yes, tactical nuclear weapons will escalate things, and that is a very good thing. A bit unnerving. And then, right, you also have the French, who ended up, they pulled out of the NATO combined, not out of NATO as an alliance, but out of the combined command structure, and went with their own nuclear program, partially because they said, right, even if with this nuclear sharing and the Americans sharing their tactical nuclear weapons, they still get one of those dual keys. And we're going to have enough nuclear weapons, first called the force de frappe and later the force de dissuasion, that basically says if it comes to a fight in Europe and the Americans kind of chicken out at the last minute, we'll start launching nukes, which will probably draw on the Soviets and the Americans anyway. We're basically keeping our own trigger on a nuclear escalation. The Americans hated it at the time. It actually was probably a good thing for everyone. And meanwhile, you had basically everyone's solution to the nuclear weapons problem was to nuke Germany, right? And I'm making a joke here. Can we all take a deep breath, bitte? But it actually became a big deal when the Germans became one of the main contributors to the West. To the NATO alliance, and it actually began German insistence on conventional buildup and maybe having more non-nuclear options. So there you go, right? Just a quick recap of the terms, right? Nuclear first use, no first use, NFU, and declared first use, DFU, is basically who is willing to use nuclear weapons first. And this can mean tactical or strategic. Usually has to do with tactical weapons, right? We'd be willing to take a conventional attack, war that's not going well for us, and make it nuclear on a small scale. Okay? Usually that's what it means. After that, you get tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. I understand it's a bit fuzzy, but tactical weapons, remember, right? They're designed to kind of be mixed in with conventional forces. They tend to be more mobile. They tend to be shorter range. Then you have strategic nuclear weapons, right? And these can take the form of bombers, different kinds of missiles, and so on. These are designed to hit enemy strategic nuclear forces, right? And potentially enemy cities, right? When you're hitting nuclear forces, it's called counter force, right? And that's just the actual nukes, the C2 systems, and so on. When you're hitting cities and industry, that's called counter value. A first strike is usually, right, if you think about how first strikes are usually designed, it's to knock out the enemy's strategic nuclear infrastructure. So first strikes are typically counter force, and second strikes are typically counter value. Now, I understand there's a lot of fuzziness in between. There's a particular way I like to think about weapons, and my own take on the divides between kind of these crude tables here. But that's a separate discussion. For those of you who are really interested, I will produce a part 2 to show you how I think about this personally.